What if the problem isn't competitiveness? What if it's that there are too many people competing for too few good jobs that lead to a stable middle-class life? In both the US and in Korea, there is tremendous anger and anxiety, pretty much for the same reason. Men raised in an era when middle-class jobs and housing were available pretty much for anyone willing to work hard, find that they can't have what their fathers had, a stable middle-class standard of living with the wife, the house, the car, and the kids. In Europe and America, angry young men blame immigrants. In Korea, angry young men blame young women. Now, it's true that young men now have to compete with young women for jobs in Korea. In the young men's father's generation, men held pretty much 100% of the good jobs. And now, it's true, women are also in competition for those jobs. But it's not the young women who are to blame. Here's an abiding truth. Anger flows downhill. People tend to express anger at those who are lower in status, in part because it's less risky to do that than it is to express anger against those in power. So young men blame not the wealthy and wealthy corporations who drive up profits by corroding the quality of jobs. Instead, they blame young women. And in fact, nearly 80% of Korean men in their 20s believe that discrimination against men is a serious problem in Korea. So how do we explain this? Really helpful here are a series of studies by social psychologists called the masculinity threat studies. What these studies show is that when men's masculinity is threatened, men tend to exaggerate ever more exaggerated forms of masculinity. For example, employed wives of unemployed husbands typically face greater risk of domestic abuse. So do employed wives who earn more than their husbands. But the coolest of these masculinity threat experiments is by social psychologist Rob Willer and his colleagues. They brought men into the lab, had them take an assessment, and told one group of them that they had scored just inside the femininity on the femininity-masculinity scale. The other group of men, they told them they were solidly masculine. So the men who had experienced masculinity threat were more likely to support an ongoing war, had more negative views of homosexuality, were more likely to prefer a big car, an SUV, and they also reported negative affect. They were bummed out. You know what? There's little that threatens men's masculinity more than making them unable to perform the provider role. Okay, let's go back to the graphs that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. What those graphs, I think, represent is that Koreans' men's expectations of Korean women are very different from Korean women's expectations of Korean men. This is epitomized by one story that somebody told me while I was in Korea. She said that her brother, who had never married, and the reason, she said, is because he wanted a woman like my mother who would stay home and take care of him, and he never found a woman who wanted that. Men expect that things will be the way they traditionally have, and in fact are becoming more conservative. Women's expectations are that things will change in the direction of equality. What's the path forward? The first step is to reform labor laws to guide companies back to offering people stable, full-time jobs in regular work in a way that doesn't prove too threatening for people who are currently in those regular jobs. But, you know, those Koreans in regular work will suffer too if the birth rate remains so far below replacement rate. Korean women now have on average 0.72 children. That's in a context where replacement rate in a developed society, as I mentioned before, holding a stable job in a society that cannot sustain itself will not yield a good life, even for those people currently holding regular jobs. The second necessary step is to explain to young men that it's not their fault that society has failed them. To counter their mourning for a provider role that, you know, realistically few of them will attain, it's important to point out that the economy of the future will offer them something that their fathers never had: the ability to find fulfilling work that does not put upon them the kind of hydraulic pressure to be a sole provider that their fathers endured. What's needed is a more attractive vision of the future to counter the existing narrative of rip-off and loss. To raise the low birth rate, people have been focused in Korea on how to change conditions for women. I think it's also important to focus on how to change conditions for men, how to return Korea to an economy that has enough good jobs in regular work to assuage the hurt feelings of young men mourning their ability to support a family. You know what? Young men, young women are mourning the same thing.